This is the tropical rainforest of Far North Queensland. In 1800, a tree kangaroo could have climbed from tree to tree all the way from here to Broome in Western Australia, and all the way south to Townsville, some 500 kilometres from here. Could have climbed all the way to the coast, some 60 kilometres from here. It can't do that now. In 1900, men came here, they surveyed this land, and they parcelled it up and sold it on to selectors, who came here not long afterwards and began clearing the land, building farms and houses, making homes for themselves. And from the wood that they cut down, they built a town. That town is only some few hundred metres from where I'm standing. This forest is just a remnant of what was once here, a reminder of the past, of the beginnings of the town of Malanda. This is not a history of Malanda full of facts and figures and dates and politics. For that you can come here to the Eacham Historical Society with its excellent records of everything that happened in Malanda. Here you can read about the great people who made an impact in this town. You can see their photographs and you can read research about their lives. And you can come to places like the Malanda Hotel and see the pictures of the people and the events that stood out in the beginning. Of course, any history of Malanda will mention the main events and the important people. People like the Englishes, who, with others, practically built Malanda out of nothing, starting with this fine hotel. People like the Princes, who felled the first scrub and built the sawmill that everyone relied upon for their first decent house. People like the Emersons, who brought cattle here, and others. But this story is not about people who have streets named after them. It is not about people who left indelible marks on the official history of this place. That is one kind of history. This programme is about a very small number of people who left us a history of a different kind. They left us their experiences. They wrote down what it was actually like to live here when there were no roads, no houses, no electricity, no hospital, no store, no refrigeration. There was mud and rain and mud. And when there wasn't rain and mud, there was hardship and tragedy. There were good times and there were bad times. They told us what it was like. People like Lila Landry, who came here in 1909 as a very young child and who, in the 1970s, wrote about her experiences in 5 closely written pages of clear and beautiful prose. Ralph Seamark came here at the tender age of 18 months. He also, later in life, wrote down his memories of the early days. People like Nurse Varley, who wrote about living here from the very beginning and tending to the sick and the pregnant. We don't even have a picture of Nurse Varley. She is probably in this picture somewhere of the opening of the Malanda Hotel. But her words come to us through time, telling us about the drama of living here. Of course, there were the tree cutters, too. Arnold William Jones travelled into the scrub with the selectors of the English group. And John Roberts, who worked as a reporter for the first newspapers in the area, and in 1924 wrote down and published the only first-hand account of the history of the early days of the Tablelands. Of course, it all had to start somewhere. The first people to come here were, of course, the Australian Aboriginal peoples. When they first came and how long they lived here, we don't know. Undoubtedly, they lived in the rainforest, for John Roberts heard of many who were extremely skilled in rainforest survival.
They are experts in trapping birds and animals, also climbing trees for bees' nests. They can climb to any height with vines to secure honey from a nest. They are very keen of sight. Their outfit consists of stone axe, spear and boomerang, shield and other curious shaped sticks. They have many ways of communicating with one another, by marking trees and placing stones with marks upon them. They are cunning as it is possible to be.
The first of the new Australians to come here were, of course, the prospectors, but they mostly passed through the forest to pan for gold in the mountain streams of the ranges. By 1900, the Australian gold rushes were nearing an end. Arnold Jones came with the first English expedition.
We travelled the road to Lake Eacham, which continued on to the gold mining centre at Bunji, which by this time was abandoned except for a few fossicas.
At about this time, the area that was to become Malanda was surveyed, and blocks of land were defined and put up for selection. One of the earliest of the selectors was James English. Arnold Jones travelled with Stan and Percy Davies and James English, the leader of the English group, on their first trip into the scrub to see the type of country they had selected to clear. English had realised that quality wood was much in demand in Australia, and he hoped that there would be some decent trees in the land that he had selected. In 1907, they set out from Atherton.
I was a stranger to tropical jungle, and I was amused at old Jimmy's excitement when he saw the tall crowsfoot elms. When we struck more big boyangs, Jimmy went wild with excitement, threw up his hand and shouted,
Wait fella, wait till you see all the paspalum growing in this country.
We crossed the Barron at the picnic crossing and came up into the forest pocket where later the town of Yungaburra was established. We carried with us one blanket each and enough bread to last 3 days. Also a pea rifle, a billy can of butter and a red cattle dog which they had brought with them from the Richmond River. We camped on the bank of Lake Eacham the first night, sleeping in pairs with one blanket under and one over the two of us. We told yarns we had heard about these lakes which had no outlets and about bunyips that had an underground waterway allowing them to go from one lake to the other without going overland. During the night, Jimmy made us think the bunyip was with us by firing a shot and bringing down a green possum, a kind that we'd never seen before. The next morning we got away to a good start following the track made by Surveyor Maguire's party to Pat English's allotted block near where Malanda is now. The track led through granite rocks for about a mile to a spot where the township of Pyramid now stands. Old Jimmy nearly turned blue.
This is no good, Percy. The bastards have had us, Percy.
However, the land changed again, and Jimmy was pleased. We left our blankets and the dog at the camp while we inspected the blocks, and we were all very satisfied with them. Jimmy shot a turkey and a couple of pigeons, which when boiled were good eating.
English returned to New South Wales and came back the following year with his family and began to work on his block. Many others were at work in the area too, and the first order of business was to put a roof over their heads.
It was only 2 miles of road towards my block. I had to shift galvanised iron to build a hut and all our belongings by hand. I first erected an iron hut near Dingo Pocket.
Nurse Varley arrived in 1909.
The experiences of those early days were hard and trying in the extreme, especially to women, as we had no conveniences whatever. I personally lived in a 12-foot by 12-foot canvas humpy until a sawmill opened by Mr. J. Prince Sr. came to our rescue. And then we built suitable homes and struggled along until they were paid for.
The construction of homes was an interesting study in human perseverance. The men came first and constructed the most basic of dwellings to give them shelter. Many were no more than lean-to shacks with iron roofs. Some were more elaborate.
The next item was to put together poles and cover them with galvanised iron and divide into rooms with hessian. This was the way most of the homes were built, although some split timber and made slab humpies.
The next stage of housing was undertaken by the family men, who wanted somewhere to house their family as soon as possible. Lila Landry's father bought a selection at Jagan.
Jagan is an Aborigine name meaning thick scrub with lawyer vines. How true. Men had to cut their way through it. On a map, a lot of the area is described as undulating country with dense vine and scrub and chocolate-rich soil. I remember it as red.
Lila was only 4 years old when she came to live on the selection.
I came to Malanda when the hotel was opened. I remember being warned about the red paint on the building as I and my sister wore white dresses. The last whites we ever had, as the red mud stained everything. After staying a few days, we went to Jagan, where Dad, with the help of his brother Jack, had built a little house out of timber they had cut.
The second generation of homes was still very basic. The Landry home was a simple 4-wall structure. In this picture of an unknown, house-proud settler woman, we can see how she has made the best of things with the standard paraphernalia of the settler lifestyle. Tin plates and mugs were standard, as crockery couldn't make it on packhorse. And the iron stove would have come in by ox cart. The roof beams are rough timber, but basic or not, these early dwellings were the family's protection from the elements. As they went on, the houses were extended when necessary and replaced completely when the family had made enough money to build. But life in those early days was hard.
Mum had learned to make damper in camp ovens. There was no store to start with. I remember the bread dough in a basin, wrapped in a cloth and put in someone's bed when she got up, so the warmth would help make it rise. There was a creek nearby, and the water was brought to the house by horse and slide in kerosene tins. The slide was used a lot, as it slid over the mud, where cartwheels would dig in. It rained an awful lot, and there was red mud everywhere. It sometimes rained for 6 weeks, and I can still see the little house strung with rope lines and clothes drying.
And people made the best of everything they had. Nothing was thrown away, and the essentials of life were often made from the packaging and wrappings of the supplies that had to be bought.
We kids didn't own a pair of shoes until we were leaving Jagan. Kerosene tins were used to cart water, boil water, and cut down to make buckets. The pine cases that 2 kerosene tins came in were used to make little cupboards. Lights were candles, lanterns and lamps. Lawyer vines, when dry and peeled, could be used to make chair seats. I remember it used for the teacher's cane. My brother Artie said he had pants made out of sugar bags, and we girls had ours made out of flour bag calico. Later, Mum sent to Brisbane for clothes. One day a parcel came with a new dress for Clara. She put it on and ran to the dairy to show Mum, and fell in the mud.
Until the railway arrived, first at Pyramid, and then at Malanda, and eventually near Lila at Jagan and Tarzali, everything had to come by packhorse and cart. Ralph Seamark, at the age of 18 months, didn't remember much about his arrival, but that's how he came.
The only method of transport was on horseback or pack horses. Horseback was for riders, pack horses were used for carrying such things as 50-pound sacks of flour, 70-pound sacks of sugar, cases of kerosene which contained 2 4-gallon cans, tools for felling trees and sawing them into lumber. In fact, anything that was needed went in by pack horse. I was too young to ride a horse, so Dad put my younger brother Len and me in boxes on each side of the horse. The track through the timber was just wide enough for the horse and the boxes to pass through without hitting a tree. Some workmen were cutting a road which would link up with the railway when it came. One man yelled out, "My goodness, there's a boy in that box!" Then another said, "There's one in the other side too." Of course, I don't remember this, but it was one of the incidents I was told of later.
Ralph remembers his family's stove arriving. It was the first big purchase, the first thing every family bought when they could afford it, and when the roads were wide enough to bring it in.
There were 2 cast iron camp ovens, one large and one much smaller. There were 4 cast iron saucepans and a cast iron kettle. On a shelf above the fire, we kept Bell's No. 4 wax vestas. They would stay alight for a long time and would strike on any dry surface. The stove eventually arrived at the end of the road. Now it had to be hauled along a track wide enough for one horse only. Our only horse had to learn to haul a slide, but old Ginger soon proved himself adept as a harness horse. During the evening of the second day, after a valiant effort, he hauled the stove up to the fireplace. We placed the stove on a raised floor made of earth and rock. We then walled it in on 3 sides with rocks and earth, so as to make it a good oven for baking bread.
In general, food was of the most basic kind. In the main, only raw ingredients were available, and the settlers had to make up their own meals and bake their own bread. A difficult enough task, even when you had a stove.
The oatmeal was soaked overnight. I remember dried apples, peas and currants. We kids used to like boiled rice with currants in it. Mum put dried peas between 2 wet bags for them to sprout for a green veggie. Golden syrup came in 7-pound tins. We kids used to eat fruits and berries with no ill effects. As more land was cleared, Cape gooseberries, passion fruit and cherry tomatoes started to grow everywhere. Each farmer would take turns killing a beast, and it would be shared amongst them. Fresh meat and then salted. The same when a pig was killed, and Dad learned to make bacon. The dead pig would have boiling water poured all over it, and we all got to work with billy lids and anything sharp and scraped all the bristles off. Mum used to make soap from the fat. Dad used to shoot turkeys and brown pigeons, and a wild plum grew in the scrub. Very sour, but Mum used to make jam out of them.
When the railway came close enough to the settlers, life became easier. It arrived in Pyramid in October 1910, then Malanda in December of that year, then Jagan and Tarzali by 1916, and then it continued its way out to Milla Milla. As the railway came, so did more people. There were those who worked on the railway, and there were those who saw the opportunity in the railway. The Englishes built a hotel, and Malanda was founded on land that was part of their selection. They were compensated enough so that they could buy up almost all the blocks on the appropriately named English Street. The only exception was the block owned by Mr. Alf Moses, roughly where the Bendigo Bank stands now. The railway allowed a grand opening of the Malanda Hotel, and people came from many miles to join the celebrations. One account tells us that while the festivities were going on, a group of young men sneaked upstairs to where the babies were sleeping. They took the babies and mixed them up, thinking it would be tremendously funny. The humour was not shared by the mothers, as they had to sort out which baby belonged to whom. We are assured they succeeded. How the young men were punished for this unwise joke, history does not tell. Of course, life in the bush began by clearing the land. In the early days of the settlement, the scrub was cut down when possible, left to dry and burned. Quite often the wet season made much of the work difficult. But with the railway coming, the selectors were able to fell trees and export wood to the rest of Australia. And so felling timber became the first major industry. Trees were cut using two-man cross-cut saws and broad axes, with the men standing on springboards wedged into the side of the tree. When exporting logs, all the same issues applied to getting the wood out of the area as applied to getting anything else in. And there were accidents and tragedies. If anyone was injured or became ill, they were a long way from a hospital. Nurse Varley did her best.
Being a nurse, it was frequently my lot to be called to the aid of sufferers, either selectors' wives or scrub accidents, and to get out of bed at 2 a.m. and ride miles over impassable roads required more than ordinary nerves. I had several narrow escapes. I was riding to Chumbarumba one morning, quite alone, at 3 a.m, and suddenly out of the darkness loomed a figure. But it was only a local policeman, so we exchanged greetings and passed on.
Some of the selectors had cause to mourn their decision to pioneer in the far north.
I shall never forget the year 1910. Mr. John Prince Sr. was blown up with blasting powder, and Mrs. Prince and myself had hard work saving his life. The same evening, the second daughter of Mrs. Eli Prince was born, the first white child to be born in the Johnson River area, June 10, 1910.
Charlie Hop Hop died from typhoid as a young man in 1913, one of the victims of a serious outbreak that occurred in Yungaburra, Kareen and Malanda. And in January 1912, the 13-year-old daughter of the Princes died from a fever. Whether she could have been saved by a hospital or not, her parents must have felt awful guilt at having brought her to a place so out of reach of medical aid. Roads were needed and they were built, often with back-breaking work. The many creeks had to be bridged as they went. John Roberts described the building of a new road from the Upper Barron to the Merrygallen area.
The road was started at Rockley's Pocket. A crossing was put in at Breen Creek. The road was cut through Phelps Scrub to Ginn Creek, where another crossing was put. The continuation was on through Emerson's Felling to the Johnson River. After a long jog and all hands working hard, this difficulty was overcome. The road was terminated at Jack Roberts.
Clearing the land meant space to breed cattle and to develop dairies. The land around Malanda was better suited for stock than crops.
When firing time came in October, each one helped the other to light, and so the first clearing sprang forth. As soon as the firing was done, the grass seed was sown, the principal grass being paspalum, Rhodes and white Dutch clover. It was a choice season, and therefore the grass grew quickly, and soon had the ground covered with a coat of first-class cattle feed.
And once the land was cleared, they needed stock to populate it with. James English and others brought cattle to the area as early as 1908. It came up the coast by boat, and many of these cattle won prizes at the local shows. But James Emerson decided to bring cattle overland in 1909. John Roberts tells the story. It was no picnic.
Mr. Emerson visited his many cattle friends, and after weeks of picking, got together a mob of 1,026 head of all the best breeds of stock. He picked up a few competent drovers and saw his mob leave Lismore in 1909. Many weary weeks passed before they even got into Queensland, but the tucker cart was kept full. After crossing over the border, the biggest trouble commenced. They were in tick country. Losses began with tick fever, red water, and many other things. But on they came, dipping, resting, and away again. Disaster befell the unfortunate mob at Newenden, and when the roll was called, somewhere in the vicinity of 560 remained. This number reached their destination on the Tableland after a journey of 16 months.
Once the basics of life had been established, things really started to move. John Roberts summarises it.
Houses, bale yards and barns are being erected. The shire was formed and good work was got through by the overseers. Banks were springing up at all centres. Bullock teams were now greatly in evidence and logs being hauled to the railway and mills in abundance.
The arrival of the railway led to the first real income for the selectors, as they were able to sell the wood that they had been clearing instead of burning it and leaving it to waste on their property. And there was the weather. Even though the railway had made it in 1910, it was continually shut down during the wet season. The newspaper reports of the Times have more to say about how badly the railway was constructed than about almost any other matter. A railway company that was used to building railways in the outback can hardly be blamed for its failings in the tropical rainforest. But the selectors weren't pleased. The wet season made many things impossible. And then, in 1913, the settlement of Malanda, where most people still lived in their basic houses, got its first cyclone.
During the cyclone, which did much damage in 1913, I was called to a rather serious case 5 miles from my home. I had been ill in bed for a week, and as there was no one else to go, I simply had to. I rode it 12 times in 12 days, over fearful roads, and also had to cross a flooded creek night and morning. The last morning which I went was almost my last on earth. I had just congratulated myself on getting safely over when my stirrup leather broke. I immediately dismounted, and with a woman's implement, the most despised hairpin, I mended the broken leather, when, just as I had finished my task, down came a huge tree. It was so close that it bumped my horse on the nose. It is a certainty, if I had been 1 foot closer, nothing on earth would have saved me. My one alternative was to tie the horse to the tree and finish the rest of my journey on foot.
The cyclone appears in many accounts. As a small boy of only 4 years old, Ralph Seamark remembers.
There came on a heavy thunderstorm one evening. I was the only one at the house. Some little white stones were hitting the ground. I had never seen them before, so I gathered some in an empty matchbox to show Mother when she came back from milking the cow. But when I opened the box, the little stones had vanished.
But it wasn't all hardship, of course. People made their fun as well. In town, the hotel held regular functions, its official opening in December 1911 being a particularly magnificent event. There were dances and sports days advertised in the cairns and Tableland papers for people to come to Malanda to compete in wood shops, running and children's games. There were outings as well, and excursions would go both up and down the railway line. And there were the shows, where the whole countryside would gather to award prizes to the best cattle, produce, cooking and to the finest riders. Even in the bush, too far to go regularly to town for dances and films, there was entertainment.
Sometimes there would be a dance at somebody's house. Dad played the accordion and mouth organ, and someone else the fiddle. How I loved that music. Kids would be bedded down everywhere, then dragged off in the early hours in time to get the cows in to milk them.
But it was a hard life, and the achievements of the first settlers are that they gave birth to one of the closest communities in Australia. One wonders if they guessed, when they came, that their town would eventually have one of the largest dairy centres in the area, the best theatre, and that it would run its own affairs under its own council for nearly 100 years. The shire they created is now, like them, history, and the railway is gone. Current stories in the news make us wonder if we now stand on the verge of the end of the dairy industry. And with the closure of the railway came the end of the timber industry, and the forests are now protected. But perhaps the words of Winston Churchill, while meant for more serious matters, might bring us some comfort. He said, "This is not the end, nor is it the beginning of the end, but it may, perhaps, be the end of the beginning."